from a speeding boat onto a drug runner sub. Some California-based Coast Guard officers were determined to not let some alleged smugglers get away. Take a look at this.
They looked like waves until the hatch cracked. Out in the open Pacific and Atlantic, low gray shapes skimmed the surface, nearly invisible to radar and the naked eye. When the Coast Guard finally boards them, the truth hits like a storm.
Eventually, a Coast Guard boat maneuvered alongside the drug sub. Crew members jumped onto the speeding sub, no life jackets and no safety rope. One sailor pounded on the hatch, and the men on board were arrested.
Crews gasping through diesel fumes, and a single valve ready to send everything to the bottom in minutes. Are these submarines? Not exactly, something darker. Built to sink themselves, designed to vanish, and funded by cartels that swap coasts like coordinates, these craft have crossed oceans and changed the game. The hatch that opened. On June 18, 2019, in the Eastern Pacific, the Coast Guard cutter Monroe encountered what at first looked like nothing more than a strange, slow-moving capsule drifting among the waves. The object rode so low in the water that from a distance it almost seemed like debris. Its dull gray surface offered no flag, no markings, no reason to draw attention, and yet it caught the eye of trained lookouts. The Coast Guard had been hunting substance traffickers in these waters for months, and experience told them this was no fishing boat. Something was off. The silhouette was too crude to be commercial, too low to be casual, and too quiet to be innocent. From the cutter came a small chase boat, which sped toward the target. What followed was no ordinary operation. It was dangerous, almost reckless, but for necessity. Two Coast Guardsmen jumped onto the slippery deck of the capsule while the craft was still moving fast. There were no handrails, no flat surfaces, just a winding top barely breaking the waterline. A single misstep would find a man slipping down into the sea, disappearing in between swells. Still, that urgency was paramount. These men knew that every second counted because these vessels are engineered to disappear. If, inside, the actual crew pulled even one lever, the boat would vanish with all due speed, taking both itself and the illicit cargo down with it forever. They were banging on the hatch with their fists, urging the smugglers inside to open up. The ocean swallowed their voices, and nothing happened for a long moment. Coast Guardsmen clung to the wet steel, their adrenaline coursing and waiting for a response that may never come. Every second stretched into infinity. Then, in a suddenness that was creepy, the hatch lifted from below. It creaked open, and from the dark mass inside, one stunned face of a smuggler emerged. He looked up into the bright sun, squinting, caught between fear and resignation. The boarding team yelled commands and moved fast to secure the opening before anyone inside could change their minds. What met the eyes when the hatch swung wide was far beyond anything seasoned crews would have even set eyes on. The toilet, as they used to euphemistically describe the interior, was packed, wall to wall, with bales of substance wrapped in shrink plastic. Brick after brick, the load was stacked, roof and floor, leaving the faintest of passages for the operators to crawl through. Fuel, plastic, and what? The smell may have mixed, but the sheer sight of it was overwhelming, incredible. Later on, the final tally was done, and the weight came up to over 17,000 pounds. Over 8 tons of substance on one flight, with undetected passage until luck and guts brought the Coast Guard to it in person. With the footage from that day, the moment was cast in raw intensity. Crews in helmets and vests crouched on the deck, their embrace of the hatch in one hand, steadying themselves against the sea. The smuggler inside was frozen, the hold behind him the fortress of contraband. But for the Coast Guard, it was not just a measured victory in pounds, it was a victory measured in proof that the so-called narco subs were real and running, carving staggering amounts of cargo across the open water. Little did anyone on deck know that hatch moment was only a preview of what these boats are engineered to do next. Vanish by design, built to disappear. The strange vessels that the Coast Guard encounters aren't true submarines in the naval sense. They don't plunge into the deep ocean or cruise beneath the waves for weeks at a time. Instead, they live in a twilight zone, half ship, half submersible, riding so low in the water that only a sliver of their structure is visible above the surface. From certain angles, they look like little more than driftwood floating in the swell. From radar screens, they nearly vanish. And that is no accident. These crafts are designed with a single purpose in mind: to disappear. The craft are through and through self-propelled semi-submersibles, or SPSP, designed to avoid being seen by either trained eyes or trained electronic eyes. They are therefore painted muted gray or blue to blend with the ocean horizon. Their hulls are almost drowning, with either a simple rocking frame or a narrow spine outlook. Seeing one in waves requires not just good luck, but also some good fortune. This blessing comes from the chance of being at the right place at the right time. Such a design is worth its money for cartels moving tons of substances through long stretches of ocean. The closer they are to invisibility, the better their odds of getting past patrolling. But stealth is only part of the story. Surely the danger of the vessels lies not just in how they move, but also in how they are intended to end. Almost every semi-submersible has a crude but brutally effective countermeasure: the scuttle valve. At a glance, it seems like nothing, just some simple opening whose way can be turned or levered. But when turned, water rushes in. In a matter of minutes, the boat fills up, the cargo floods, and the whole vessel sinks beneath the surface. No evidence, no trail, no recoveries. This is an important shift for boarding teams. Every time they leap onto a narco sub, they are racing against time, not just to apprehend the suspects, but to prevent the crew from scuttling their own boat and running away with the substances. As it happens, the method works. Over and over, crews have reassured the loss of their vessels and sacrificed millions of dollars in substance to prevent prosecution from getting too close. An astounding example occurred merely 3 months after the bust at Monroe in September 2019. The Coast Guard cutter Valiant intercepted a 40-foot semi-submersible carrying approximately 12,000 pounds of substance. By the time the boarding party stepped in, the vessel was already beginning to show some instability. They managed to hoist out several hundred pounds of substance before the craft rolled over and sank. Over 10,000 pounds of substance went down the ship and were lost in the ocean forever. Such instances of scuttling are not uncommon. They are the norm. The manufacturers understand that their ship will only survive or die, and little else. Some even go so far as to equip their vessels with redundant scuttling systems. This explains why, in boarding videos, law enforcement always seems frantic and in danger, not for effect, but for survival. Waiting too long means losing evidence and the mission. If these boats are engineered to disappear, where and how are they born? And how does a jungle turn out ocean-crossing machines? Jungle shipyards, real oceans. If you picture a submarine under construction, you probably imagine vast shipyards, steel beams, and cranes lifting massive sections into place. But the birthplaces of narco subs could not be more different. To find them, you'd have to push deep, into Colombia's coastal jungles, follow winding rivers through mangrove swamps, and listen closely. Somewhere between the buzz of insects and the calls of birds, you might hear an unnatural rhythm, the thump of a generator, the whine of saws, and the scrape of fiberglass being sanded smooth. These are the sounds of clandestine boatyards, hidden under tarps and trees, where stealth vessels take shape far from curious eyes. There are no roads leading to these makeshift factories. Trucks hauling resin drums or diesel engines would be spotted immediately. Instead, every piece of material has to be floated in by canoe or carried by hand through the thick undergrowth. Fuel drums, fiberglass cloth, wooden frames, even the food that workers eat. Everything arrives disguised as fishing gear or blended into normal river traffic. Once delivered, the materials are assembled beneath layers of canvas tarps strung across the treetops, ensuring that satellites and drones scanning overhead will see nothing but jungle. The work done inside these camps is quite organized. The crew cuts the wooden rib into a form that creeps over a hull skeleton, and then stretches fiberglass over it and applies resin on it until a hardened shell begins resembling a hull. Sometimes splitting the process into sections, a bow here, a stern there. Each piece was built in isolation and stashed under the canopy. Only when the time is right do the sections get dragged to a secluded creek and joined. It appears rather crude, but it works well. However, boats usually are slipped into rivers at midnight, their engines chugging to life and preparing to climb towards an open sea. The boats in question are generally of two different kinds. A low-profile vessel, or LP5, is the first. Imagine a boat so narrow and flat that it rides just inches above the waterline. From far off, you would never think it was anything but driftwood or a log. Only a small cockpit and a thin strip of hull rise above the waves. These are usually built from fiberglass stretched over wooden frames, which makes them light, cheap, and easy to shape. The entire design revolves around just one idea: to stay invisible. Every single year, these designs undergo refinements as builders hone the design, smoothing edges, lowering profiles, and balancing for lesser detection. This is another advanced category where the definition of CPSS, or self-propelled semi-submersible, comes to the fore. They float even lower than LPVS, and often ballast tanks have been utilized to sink the boat deeper into the depths, allowing only a small canopy or spine to be visible. They are not built to dive deep or stay underwater for a long time, like military submarines. But they do not need to be so. Not for battle, at least. Instead, they are supposed to work undetected, and in that, they have been terrifyingly successful. To add to the wonder of these jungle creations, some have progressed even further. A so-called super sub was exposed by authorities in Colombia in July 2010. It was 74 feet long, carbon and Kevlar coated, and was powered by diesel-electric engines and a proper conning tower. It was also supposed to dive deeper than the normal SPSS model, with an operational range of almost 7,800 miles. The investigators could hardly believe it. It was not a crude fiberglass canoe with bales of substance, but a vessel whose design features entered into the realm of naval engineering, presumably fabricated under tarps in the jungles. By 2019, narco subs had crossed the Atlantic. Spanish cops had intercepted the coast of Galicia, carrying a bulk of 6,600 pounds of substance. Under its own power, it made the case that those jungle-built boats were not experimental toys anymore. These became proper machines that could cross oceans and give patrols the slip from two continents. Cartel financiers see the math clearly. A single SPSS might cost $1 to $2 million to build. Fishing boats are far cheaper to make, But anything is cheap compared with a commercial ship. For thousands of pounds of substance, worth millions and millions, all that risk is nothing compared with the potential return. Even with some loss and interception on deliveries, the substance sold from a single delivery is enough to pay for the whole operation hundreds of times over. But sleek hulls and long range mean nothing if the crew can't survive the ride. Step inside the tube. Inside the tube. Imagine stepping into a vessel no wider than a hallway closet and only slightly taller than a kitchen table. That is the reality of a narco sub from the inside. The space is a long, narrow tube, built not for people, but for cargo. Every surface is crammed with shrink-wrapped bricks of substance, stacked so tightly they leave only a sliver of walkway. The air is hot, sticky, and suffocating, heavy with the stench of diesel fumes. For the crew, there are no comforts, no bunks, no privacy, just the bare minimum needed to keep the boat running until the delivery is complete. The controls are as stripped down as the space itself. A small wheel or tiller, a throttle, and a few gauges make up the command station. Navigation is often handled by a handheld GPS, the same kind you could buy in a sporting goods store. Communication might come from a battered marine radio, or in rare cases, a more sophisticated device smuggled in to keep in contact with support boats. Everything about the design screams improvisation. Cheap, functional, and just good enough to make the run. But the illusion of simplicity hides the fact that these trips are grueling tests of human endurance. After all, even an expedition can go on for days or weeks, with close sync with huge bales of substance and gallons of fuel bladders. From the ceiling, it drips out of the slabs of fiberglass. Sticky floors are caused by spilled fuel and seawater that are not drained completely. It hangs heavy in their clothing and bedding. Ventilation is at its minimum. To every breath, there is that sweet, cool taste of carbon monoxide. The fare is meager. For example, packets of dried goods and water counted down to ounces. Sleep comes in tiny, uncomfortable bits, usually on thin mats that lie above tanks that are filled with fuel. Finally, by the end of the journey, one sees men caving pale, coughing, and shaking, their bodies beaten down by the surrounding toxic environment. Seemingly, the dangers of such conditions are no longer hypothetical. In March 2023, the Colombian Navy intercepted a semi-submersible boat measuring about 50 feet, hauling 50,800 pounds of substance. The vessel housed 2 crew members who were dead on arrival and 2 critically injured. Neither were guns fired, nor was a chase undertaken. The slayers were invisible. Toxic fumes and suffocating air in the sealed cabin. The men had poisoned themselves just by breathing. These boats are, however, death traps, since they are actually not just stealth machines. They would be used by people desperate or reckless enough to crew them. Even when the air itself may not slay, the risk never ceases. For traffickers, a scuttle valve may be an insurance policy, but for the crew, it is a potential death sentence. When a boarding team arrives and panics, it could drown the men inside the boat before the valve can be opened to escape. Some crews quickly surrender, throwing open the hatch to avoid drowning. Others hope to sink the evidence, gambling with their lives. Either way, the claustrophobic interior turns every encounter into a high-stakes standoff. That huge haul may not matter to producers if it matters at all to their crews. 1 inch of space, it could have been used by a comfortable human being, houses just fuel or substance. There would be no ventilation systems, air filters, and surely no extra food stores. those luxuries are stripped away. A single bale of substance is worth much more than another meal or even a safer working place. The priorities there brutally demonstrate. Human lives are expendable. The cargo is not. For boats this elusive, who finds them first? And how does a faint blip become a takedown? Eyes in the sky. For every narco sub that emerges from the jungle and slips into the ocean, there is an invisible game already waiting above. These vessels are nearly impossible to detect at sea level, but from the sky, the odds shift. The first sign of trouble often isn't a cutter spotting a low, gray shape. It's a patrol plane circling thousands of feet overhead, scanning endless blue for anything that doesn't belong. In this silent duel, the eyes in the sky have become the cartel's greatest adversary. The United States Customs and Border Protection flies the P-3 Orion, a former Navy sub-hunting aircraft now dedicated to substance interdiction. Outfitted with long-range radar and infrared sensors, the P-3 can sweep vast patches of ocean in a single mission. Crews describe the moment when a faint shape, a lowrider, as they call it, emerges from the waves. The profile is slim, the heat signature faint. But once detected, the game is on. In agency statistics, every hour a P-3 spends in the air keeps an average of 40 pounds of substance off American streets. That staggering figure proves just how effective the hunt has become. When it comes to aerial operations, the Coast Guards depend on the HC-130J Super Hercules. It may look just like any other cargo plane from the outside, but inside works as both a flying surveillance platform and a command post. It can search for several hundred miles of ocean, classify all contacts it sees, and send that directly to ships below. When you hear about a cutter boarding a narco sub, about 9 times out of 10, that first sighting was relayed by the aircraft, which provided the coordinates down to the waterline. Without the aerial net, the semi-subs would slip through without a sound. How about that in radar? That's just the beginning. The juicy intelligence flows down to the crew aboard the nerve center lying in Key West, called Joint Interagency Task Force South, or JYATF South. Imagine a room where personnel of the Department of Defense come together with those of Homeland Security and international colleagues, all casually looking at a living map of the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific. Every track, every possible contact comes together on that screen. After confirmation of a semi-sub, JIATF South would look at who is nearest, who is authorized, and who can actually take action. The beautiful command will order a Coast Guard cutter rushing ahead, or task some Navy warship that carries a small Coast Guard boarding team, commonly called Law Enforcement Detachment. It is this magic combination of sensors, ships, and legal authority that transforms a fleeting radar dot into an interdiction on the high seas. Almost all of the smugglers utilize a good semi-sub to venture. Some of them, however, like it speedy and have a few outboard engines for their high-speed, go-fast boats to tear across the surface. Coast Guard takes its helicopter squadron, H-1ETRON, to the rescue in such cases. They fire warning shots over the bow from above, and, if that fails, a sharpshooter leans on the helicopter door and carefully lines up a shot on the roaring engines. One good surprise burst of rifle fire can incapacitate the boat, thus terminating the chase in seconds. Recently, Hytron logged its 1,000th interdiction, demonstrating just how ubiquitous these extremely high-risk pursuits in open water are. Such operations are carried out on a huge scale. Under such initiatives as Operation Pacific Viper, Coast Guard cutters, along with Navy vessels and partner aircraft, flood into trafficking lanes for weeks at a time. In one season alone, it managed to interfere with more than 40,000 pounds within just a few weeks of operations average of 1,600 pounds a day pulled out of circulation. The seizures don't always state Narco Sub in the headlines, but the process is the same. Aerial surveillance cues the ships, and the boarding teams strike fast. Boarding a semi-sub, however, is never routine. Crews are aware that the moment they land, that the smugglers may be trying to open the scuttle valve and submerge the vessel before any evidence is able to be seized. That risk makes every mission a gamble. And for years, the nightmare was for prosecutors because if the substances went down with the vessel, charges would unravel. It was a game not just in the oceans, but also in the courtroom. Air and sea can fix a position, but what if the evidence sinks before it's hauled aboard? When sinking, still convicts. For years, every Coast Guard boarding of a narco sub carried the same frustration. Even when crews risked their lives to seize a vessel, the smugglers inside had one last weapon. All they had to do was open the scuttle valve. Within minutes, the ocean swallowed the evidence. The boat sank, the substance dissolved into the waves, and prosecutors were left with little more than a few soaked photographs and the testimony of exhausted boarding teams. Without the substances themselves, convictions often collapsed in court. It was a loophole the traffickers exploited ruthlessly, and for a long time, it worked. But in 2008, Congress slammed that loophole shut. The Substance Trafficking Vessel Interdiction Act, Title 18, U.S. Code, Section 2285, made it a felony to operate or even ride in a submersible or semi-submersible vessel without nationality, if the intent was to evade detection. In plain language, it meant that just being inside one of these boats, with no flag, no registry, and every sign of stealth intent, was enough to put you in prison. Suddenly, prosecutors no longer needed to drag bales of substance out of a sinking hull to win a case. The vessel itself became the evidence. The first major test of this law came in United States versus Valero Arroyo. There, the jury convicted even though the substances never reached a courtroom display. That ruling was upheld on appeal. The message to smugglers was crystal clear that sinking your boat no longer worked. The design, lack of nationality, evasion, and the circumstances of interception were more than sufficient proof. From that time on, the deceased sub's strongest weapon, its ability to erase itself, became its worst enemy. The new law was not only a legal transformation for Coast Guard boarding teams, it was a tactical alteration meant to preserve life. Before 2008, crews would sometimes do anything to save all the bales they could from a sinking boat. Half-flooded holds were dove into, manipulating the clock, trying to save enough physical evidence for a prosecution. After the law, that desperation was gone. The teams concentrated on securing the crew and documenting the vessel itself. Photos of hidden scuttle valves, cramped holds loaded with bladders and bales, recordings of smugglers cooperating with the prosecution. Everything became evidence. It became the case that while the substance might be lost to the ocean, the conviction will stick. The statute reconfigured the mentality around the chase. From the smuggler's perspective, hard throwing their boat is not as appealing. If they would not get free by sinking it, why risk drowning in the process? The crews have become increasingly inclined to surrender when faced with cutters or helicopters. True, they might still try to scuttle the vessel out of habit, but the incentives for evidence destruction have faded. The law transformed the ocean from a sanctuary into a snare, where mere failure to effect a delivery would also induce years of imprisonment. The effects rippled internationally. Partnering nations such as Colombia and Panama adopted the same machinery against semi-subs, disregarding whether or not there was actual substance to be recovered. That joint approach meant that the criminals would no longer be able to count on putting the narco sub into friendlier legal waters. The design of the narco sub was once a clever loophole, now a scarlet letter. As this pointed otherwise, it succeeded in marking its crew as guilty regardless. If law closes the gap at sea, the bigger question is where these tons were really headed, and who was waiting, where the tons were headed. Every bale pulled from a narco sub tells the same story. It was never meant to stay on that boat. The vessels are couriers, not warehouses, and their cargo is part of a chain that stretches across thousands of miles. Most of the runs intercepted in the Eastern Pacific begin in Colombia, where substance production remains entrenched, and aim for staging points in Central America or Mexico. From there, the substances split into countless routes, hidden in trucks, funneled through tunnels, carried on foot across remote border crossings. The United States is the primary destination, but it is far from the only one. The numbers reveal the scale. In April 2025, after 11 interdictions in the Eastern Pacific, the Coast Guard announced that the cases were tied to investigations involving Colombia's Clan del Golfo and Mexico's Sinaloa and Jalisco New Generation cartels. Each seizure wasn't just a random find. It was part of an organized multinational operation, moving product that had buyers waiting in cities across the Americas. A single SPSS packed with 6,000 pounds of substance could represent multiple shipments destined for multiple clients. Breaking one boat at sea didn't just hurt one deal, it fractured entire supply lines. This is why enormous offloads, such as that undertaken at Port Everglades in the summer of 2025, matter so much. Over 76,000 pounds of seized substances were stacked on the pier. 62,000 pounds of substances and 14,000 pounds of marijuana. None of which were destined for Florida itself. Everything was meant to go further up north, sneaking into the U.S. through the regular smuggling routes. The offload was far more than a photo op. It was a snapshot of weeks of patrols compressed into one moment dockside. Evidence that aerial hunts, boardings, and prosecutions carved entire rivers of substance out of circulation. However, the U.S. is not by far the only market. Europe, much like America, has become a target of interest in itself. Late in December 2019, a semi-submersible craft was captured off the coast of Galicia by Spanish police containing 6,600 pounds of substance. Investigators were more shocked by the journey than by the actual cargo. This boat had come by its own means across the long stretch of water from South America, a feat once regarded as impossible for a level boat that came out of a jungle boatyard. From that one case, it was only obvious that the engineering work done by cartels came so far along as to be transoceanic. One moment, Europe was not just an adjunct market. Suddenly, it was within reach. The cartels are not done innovating. In 2025, Colombian authorities captured their first uncrewed semi-sub, which carried none other than a Starlink satellite antenna bolted to its deck and remote control systems rigged inside. A test, proof of concept, however, the implications were clear. The boat could be stripped of life-supporting systems, putting more space for fuel and cargo. Range would increase, risk would plummet, and comfort, already not a consideration, would be moot. For traffickers, a logical next step in the arms race against detection. If you want more deep dives like this, like, comment, and subscribe. Tell us which chapter you want expanded into a full episode next. The jungle builds, the aerial hunt, or the legal showdown at sea. And keep watching the next video on your screen for more real-world investigations.